Our next speaker is Brielle Jaglowski, and she is a student at Cal Poly Humboldt, and she is going to be talking on factors influencing elk road crossing behavior.
Hi everyone, I'm Brielle and I'm currently a master's student at Cal Poly Humboldt, and today I'll be sharing a portion of my research focusing on the factors that are associated with elk road crossing behavior. So this study focuses on elk in northwestern California in particular, and these elk are vulnerable to incidents with vehicle collisions. Due to the high volume of tourism-related traffic on these highways, it's very close to Redwood National and State Parks. In addition, there are increasing elk numbers in many of the herds in these areas. So as densities are increasing, the risk with vehicle collisions also increases. In addition, there is a lot of preferred elk habitat on either side of US 101 in this area. So as you're driving on this highway, it's not an uncommon sight to see a photo like this, where the elk are just grazing a few feet away from the highway for hours at a time. And it's actually been identified as one of the main types of human-elk conflict in the area is this risk with vehicle collisions. So since the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which I'll refer to as CDFW, has been recording causes of elk mortality in the area, there have been a reported 87 elk vehicle collisions since 2017, and this equates to about 1 collision every month, although this is likely underrepresented as a lot of collisions go unreported. And one of the main ways to mitigate this risk with vehicle collisions is through wildlife crossing systems, which have been proven to reduce collisions with large mammals anywhere from 80 to 97%. And these systems are generally quite costly, so it's very important to consider where they're placed. So this begs the question in this area of where are the elk crossing the most, and what factors are associated with these crossings so we can choose the best spots to place these systems. And that led me to develop my main research objective, which was to evaluate how various environmental and structural factors are associated with female elk road crossing probability in northwestern California. And I focused on female elk in particular, since they're the main drivers of herd movement, and we also didn't have any male elk collar data available, so it worked out. And my main hypothesis with this objective was that female elk road crossing probability would be higher in areas that elk are primarily foraging, which is generally open grassland habitat, as well as areas that can act as natural movement corridors for elk, including riparian areas and secondary roads, as well as areas of lower perceived risk, which can be thought of as a fewer number of highway lanes, or areas with bridges where the elk can actually move under the highway. So to give you a better idea of the study area, I have northwestern California projected on this map here. And you can see the black line running through it north to south is US 101. And this black line is bisecting several orange polygons, which represent 15 different elk home ranges that are known to overlap with the highway in this area. And I'll note that the herds in Del Norte and Humboldt County, the more northern herds, contain elk of the Roosevelt elk subspecies. And then the herds down in Mendocino are Tule elk, which are a slightly smaller subspecies. And all of the elk in this region are unique in that they're non-migratory. Since they live in this comfortable coastal climate, they don't have any needs to move throughout seasons. So my analyses relied on GPS collar data, and CDFW routinely collars female elk in the area for routine management and research purposes. So the data that I used weren't collected specifically for my study, but CDFW will opportunistically free-range dart elk and place GPS collars on them. And I used data from 44 female elk, and these elk all crossed US 101 at least once during the study period, which ranged from December 2016 to December 2024. And these collars collected fixed points at different rates from 1 hour to 6.5 hours. So this resulted in a little over 200,000 GPS points. And what I did is I put the points into GIS and connected consecutive points with lines to represent the GPS steps of each individual. And what you see here is the individuals grouped by herd, represented by different colors and names on the map. And you can see US 101 represented by this white line here. And you can see that different herds interact with the highway differently. So herds like Red Schoolhouse or Big Lagoon have a lot more overlap with the highway than these herds like Little Lake and Shamrock. So my analyses focused on road crossing locations in particular, and how did I decide where these animals cross the road? Let's say we have our hypothetical female elk walking across the landscape. She eventually crosses US 101. That collar she's wearing is collecting GPS fixed points at defined intervals. And then I drew lines to connect consecutive fixed points. And at that point where the GPS step intersects with US 101, I considered the inferred crossing location for the individual. So I repeated this process across all individuals, and then input these data into a resource selection function, or RSF. And an RSF relies on both used and available points. So in this case, I used my use locations were those known crossing events, represented by this blue dot here. And available points were randomly sampled within each individual's weighted autocorrelated kernel density estimate home range. And that's represented by the blue polygon. So I only generated available points within the portion of the highway that's within the animal's home range. So the available points were generated at a 10-to-1 ratio with the use points, which are represented by those red dots. And I repeated this process for all individuals and then split the data into 80% and 20% and used 80% of the data to build the model and the remaining 20% to evaluate its predictive performance. I considered a slew of different factors in my model, mostly based on expert opinion and factors found in similar literature. And these factors included distance to forest edge, secondary road, rangeland, urban area, stream, as well as canopy cover, terrain ruggedness index, and slope. And I also considered two structural variables related to the highway, including the number of lanes and the presence or absence of a bridge structure. And before inputting these layers into the model, I wanted to take into account roadside characteristics. So this is a satellite image of a portion of my study area with US 101 running through this heavily forested area. And if I were to extract the value for canopy cover at this hypothetical road crossing location, I'd get a value at or near 0. But if you look at the area directly around the highway, it's not really representative of that surrounding habitat. So to account for this, as well as to account for inherent errors in estimation of that road crossing location, since this likely isn't the exact spot the elk crossed, I calculated the mean within a 100-meter diameter buffer around each point. And with that, the layers were almost ready to model. I first assessed for correlations, unsurprisingly found that ruggedness and slope were highly correlated. So I decided to drop slope since ruggedness had more biological significance based on similar studies. I also included interaction terms for distance to stream and presence of bridge, distance to rangeland and ruggedness, and canopy cover and distance to rangeland. I also included random intercepts to account for differences in individual ID and herd, and used the top model to spatially predict across all major highways in the study area near known elk herd locations. I then evaluated the predictive performance of the model using the Boyce index, and I used that 20% of data that I had set aside from before to evaluate it. So just some basic results here. I inferred a total of 3,602 road crossing events across the whole study period, and found that individuals crossed US 101 an average of 52 times per year, However, this ranged from 1 crossing per year to 177 crossings per year. There was a lot of variability by individual. And this equates to individuals crossing US 101 about once every 6 to 7 days. However, the herds that crossed most frequently were crossing an average of once every 2 days. And this shows the distribution of those crossing densities. So you can see areas with more crossings represented in the red and the orange segments. So some of the main hotspots were just south of Crescent City and south of Oric and a bit north of Oric as well. There was one main top model that no other models were considered competitive with. So I proceeded with this model as the top model for the rest of the analyses. And this model contained all variables, but none of the interaction terms. So to give you a better idea of the patterns associated with these predictor variables, I'm going to quick run through the partial response plots for each variable. And these are all unscaled for easier interpretation. And the gray shading is representative of 95% confidence intervals. So here we can see that higher relative road crossing probability for female elk was associated with areas closer to streams, closer to rangeland, and farther from urban areas, as well as that lower ruggedness, higher canopy cover, farther from forests, and also in the presence of bridges across more lanes and farther from secondary roads. And here are the 2 first maps from those spatial predictions based on that top model. And you can see higher relative crossing probability represented in red and lower crossing probability represented in blue. And these represent the most northern part of my study area, and then southern Del Norte and northern Humboldt counties on the right. And you can see that some of these areas like south of Crescent City and around Oric also line up with those crossing hotspots I showed on the previous maps. And then here are the maps for North Central Humboldt and Mendocino counties. And I focus these maps on areas where there are elk herds known to directly overlap with the highway or are adjacent to the highway, so that Caltrans and CDFW can focus on these areas for priority mitigation efforts. So the top predictor variable was distance to stream, and this is likely because riparian areas can be used as corridors for travel, as well as providing cover and forage opportunities for elk. However, riparian areas are also associated with thicker vegetation, somewhat rugged terrain, which can obstruct both the drivers and the elk's view when trying to cross the road. So this can be targeted as a priority area to help increase habitat connectivity. And as a lot of fish passage efforts are already being constructed in some areas, it would be useful to consider other animals like elk in these construction efforts to help increase connectivity across more species. And unsurprisingly, the second strongest predictor variable was open rangeland habitat, which, like I said earlier, is where elk primarily forage. And I will note that as much as I'd like to answer the question, why did the elk cross the road? My models don't quite get at that answer. It may be that they're just selecting for habitat that they would normally select for, and it's not necessarily where they prefer to cross the road the most. You'd have to run different models to get a better answer for that question. And one of the strongest structural variables that I included was the presence of a bridge, and found that there was higher crossing probability closer to these bridge sites. And since GPS collar data isn't telling you whether elk are crossing over or under the road, I spent last summer deploying cameras on all bridges and large underpasses in the study area to confirm if elk were actually crossing over or under the highway in those areas. So I was able to confirm the use of 5 bridge sites by elk successfully crossing under and through the bridge. They did not cross under any of the larger culverts in the study area. And I am looking forward to analyzing those camera data more to see what factors are associated with elk using these underpasses, so that underpasses can be modified to encourage more elk use in the future. In addition, there might be this aspect of seasonality going on, since just anecdotally, this camera, for example, when I went to pick it up at the end of the season, it was nearly under 4 feet of water, and I actually had to swim to retrieve it. And just a few weeks later, we did have an elk vehicle collision reported on the highway just above this location. So there might be a maximum water depth at which elk are choosing to no longer cross under the bridge, but instead going over and around. So that's a really interesting area of future research I'd like to look into. And then just to wrap it all up, I'm hoping that these results will be useful for Caltrans and CDFW to highlight priority areas to install crossing systems like underpasses. And I'll quick point out that the location of this photo here is actually going to be the site of a new crossing system going into place later this year, which will involve dynamic messaging signs, communicating with transceivers and GPS collars to hopefully alert drivers to elk on or near the roadway. And hopefully all of these efforts will work to reduce vehicle collision risk, increase safety for humans and elk, and also increase habitat connectivity. And I'd just like to quick thank Caltrans and CDFW for their tremendous financial support, and CDFW for all of the field efforts that went into making this project possible, as well as everybody else that helped with the methodology and analyses that went into it. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Have access to any wildlife people with your model.
Yes, so the question was about if I have access to wildlife vehicle collision data, and I do. So that's actually the next step in this modeling process, is I'm going to plot those vehicle collision occurrences across that spatial projection I showed to see how that lines up with relative crossing probability, and also develop a similar model using just those wildlife vehicle collision data and see what factors are associated with those. Yes.
Is there any current fencing in those locations?
Yes, so the question was if there's any current fencing in these locations. The answer is that there's very limited elk-proof fencing in these areas. Elk-proof fencing has to be very high in order for the elk not to go over it. And it only occurs over a very small stretch of my study area. So I didn't incorporate it as a factor into any of my modeling just because there was such limited data. Did that answer your question, Philly?
Picture shows.
Yeah, they can handle these 3-foot fences very easily.
Sorry if I missed it, but I was curious what the traffic volume is and if it's consistent across that whole stretch of the merging with that.
Yes, so the question was about traffic volume and if it's consistent across the stretch of highway that I looked at. So traffic volume varies between 150 vehicles, average annual daily traffic volume, across those most remote stretches, up to about 44,000 vehicles in the more populated areas. I did do a whole separate modeling process to look at traffic volume and traffic speed, as well as time of day, and found that traffic volume and speed were not significant factors in predicting elk road crossing. My best guess is that the elk in this area are just so habituated to humans and traffic volume. Like you saw in some of these pictures of them hanging out right by the highway, they don't seem to be strongly influenced by changes in traffic volume. Yes.
The herds that were crossing more or less, are there any association between that and crossing structures, like where herds were crossing more when they were?
Yeah, so the question was about if the herds that crossed the most were associated with existing crossing structures. I found that the 3 herds that crossed the most were not any that had bridges in that area. It's more so just these herds that CDFW has identified as being more habituated to human presence and traffic. The herd that crossed the fourth most is one that had a bridge site, so they cross a little bit more frequently.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Brielle. Thank you, everyone. So our final speaker this afternoon is Jill Randall with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and she is speaking on the use of GPS collar data to plan and prioritize wildlife crossing projects in Wyoming, a case study of the Carter Mountain pronghorn herd.